Thank you all for joining us today, and welcome to the re-recording of our Introducing EnGauge Scores, engagement scores that leverage your Slate data and maximize your enrollment. This is a re-recording of the Technolutions Dive Deeper series where we, Carnegie, as a Platinum Preferred Partner, are taking some time to show you some new things that are happening in our world and some things that we're doing within Slate to innovate and try to capitalize on all the data that you're sitting on. So my colleague Mike and I are happy to have you. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get going. Mike, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Megan. Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Keene. I'm the Senior Vice President of Modeling here at Carnegie. My archetype, and if you want more information on archetypes, be sure to look at Carnegie Chem on our website, is the influential and resilient energizer. I lead our modeling team here at Carnegie. We are responsible for all things predicting student behavior and then consulting with our clients on interventions and resource allocation and anything that we can do to improve outcomes like application conversion, yield, and student success. My professional background is I have a PhD in political science, and I ended up in enrollment management because it's easier to predict student engagement than it is to predict voter behavior.
It's kind of ironic, Mike. I love to hear it. And I'm Megan Robinson. I'm our Executive Vice President of the Search and Slate Optimization Division here at Carnegie. I've been with the team 6 years, and my archetype is the engaging and confident champion. Speaking of ironies or coincidences, maybe, with engaging being part of my archetype as we talk about engagement scores. And I am connected to these through sort of a long history, full circle moment where I actually built my first set of engagement score rules in Slate back in 2018, where I just tried to assign, origin source values and other scores through fields and things to just calculate a max engagement score. So love that we're able to talk through a much more sophisticated version of that today. I want to start by saying, if you're not familiar with Carnegie, Carnegie is the human connection company. Creating meaningful and authentic human connection is at the core of what we do, and we really believe in this as a company. Our methodology is rooted in human psychology, and we blend that with deep demographic analysis to better understand brands and audiences and what connects them and their likelihood to take action. We find that by and large, higher ed has room to grow as an industry at delivering powerful emotive messaging to the right individuals at the right times, and scoring based on behavioral data helps us find who's ready for that connection as we build those lasting human connections. Today, as we introduce to you EnGauge Scores, we're going to go through the backstory of what even are engagement scores and what caused us to build what we think is a better mousetrap here for everyone to use. What's the difference between an EnGauge score and other scores that you may be receiving today? What are the benefits of EnGauge scores? How do we know that they work? And then take you into a demo of an EnGauge dashboard. And as this is a re-recording of a live webinar, we did have some time for Q&A. Maybe if we have a minute here at the end, we can tell you a couple of the questions that were submitted and how we responded to those. Mike, you want to kick us off?
Sure, happy to. So as Megan mentioned, we want to do some backstory here and a couple of pieces. One is, why are predictive analytics important for enrollment in higher ed generally? Second, a little bit more about what is engagement scoring specifically, and how has engagement scoring changed over the course of the past few decades. Then get into the rationale specifically for EnGauge, talk about the EnGauge suite of products and talk about what it is and how we build those scores. First, I think the why are predictive analytics important for higher ed is because we live in a time when understanding student behavior, understanding the who, the what, the when, and the why of students taking actions like application conversion or yield is more important than ever, because we have this challenging reality of tightening student pipelines. To be fair, this isn't the first time that higher ed has faced a looming shortage in potential prospective students. That's happened a few other times over the course of the last 50 to 75 years. But we know that it's coming, and we know that it's not going to be equally distributed by region or by institutional type, but we know that institutions need to plan for this, and obviously, and particularly enrollment offices need to plan for this. In times when enrollment offices, when institutions were seeing consistent year-over-year growth in applicants and in qualified applicants, there were frankly fewer incentives to get really good at understanding that student behavior, because when times are good, then you don't have to focus on making the absolute most of every dollar, because those resources are growing as your student populations are growing. And unfortunately, we no longer have that luxury that even when application pools do grow these days, it's often a challenge as much as an opportunity because they're growing in populations of students that are likely to have lower affinity or familiarity with your institution, which makes predicting outcomes like app conversion and yield more difficult, not less difficult. And alongside those tightening pipelines, the reality is that enrollment offices are being asked to do more with less. So operational budgets are being pinched, and anyone that works in admission or enrollment over the course of the last 4 to 5 years know that staffing shortages have been endemic to enrollment offices. And that creates additional challenges even when app pools do grow, is how do I make sense of a larger number of students to consider engaging with potentially a smaller staff and more limited budgets for things like print and communications. So the natural response when you have narrowing pipelines and shortages and resources, that's time, if that's money, if that's both, is that you have to make more effective use of those resources. You have to identify where that time, where those dollars can make the biggest difference in outcomes like application conversion and yield. So just to sum up generally, predictive analytics are important for higher ed because they help you focus limited resources on student populations at times where you can get the most from those limited resources. Alongside that, those motivations, EnGauge is grounded in 2 main observations. The first is that institutions are collecting more and more valuable behavioral data on students than ever before. And this is in large part attributed or helped by Slate and the ability to query this data in Slate, to collect and extract it in Slate. And 2, that many institutions are not using this newfound depth and breadth of behavioral data anywhere near as much as they could or should be. So I'll return to those in a bit, but first I want to talk about engagement scoring generally before we talk about EnGauge specifically. Engagement scoring is not new. It has a pretty long history in enrollment, and it has a pretty long history in lots of other industries, especially industries where the purchase decision has a relatively long time frame and a pretty significant price tag. And higher ed is both of those things. It's an unusual, it's a special, it's a unique purchase decision, but it is still a purchase decision. It also has a pretty significant price tag often, and it has a very long purchase period, right? It has 18, 24 months or more that students and their families are learning about institutions, are building affinity, and are coming to make that enrollment decision. Even compared to the largest purchase decisions that individuals and families will otherwise make, things like homes and cars, higher ed has a uniquely long decision period. So in that context, engagement scoring in higher ed and enrollment is pretty straightforward. It's the process of measuring how your prospective students are connecting with you across all of the different channels that you're using, and then using that measurement over time to develop a more thorough understanding of their likely behavior. Now, institutions have been doing engagement scoring for a long time, and they just didn't call it engagement scoring. So anytime an institution logged who visited campus and used that to understand yield behavior, that was engagement scoring. Anytime an institution tracked who returned an inquiry postcard, that was engagement scoring. Engagement scoring isn't new. What is new is faster and more comprehensive access to lots of different ways to measure engagement, especially in Slate, so that it's not just a yes, no on visit or yes, no on postcard, but in fact, hundreds or thousands of different data points that can be measured at different times and can be associated with outcomes like application and enrollment. Now, these hundreds, these thousands or more of different data points are a gift, but they're also a challenge. They're a gift because it opens up this new world of potentially better decision making. It's a challenge because for enrollment professionals, it can feel very much like you're drinking from a fire hose. 20 years ago, I promise you that every director of admission or dean or VP of enrollment could tell you the difference in yield between a student who visited campus and a student who didn't. Many fewer of those same people today could tell you the same relationship between yield and concepts like time on site or email click rate or ping. So our task at Carnegie and in developing a product suite like EnGauge is to take this explosion of depth and complexity of the ways that we're measuring engagement, make sense of it, and then provide that back to our client institutions in consumable ways so that they can act on it the same way that institutions for decades have acted on campus visit campaigns or on inquiry postcard campaigns. So the form of this is not different. The substance of it is not different. What is different is our toolkit and the available ways we have to measure engagement. It's also important in not just to know that engagement scoring isn't new, but that engagement scoring doesn't replace more traditional predictors of student behavior. it sharpens them, it supplements them. So even when we have tons of reliable academic data, reliable financial data, reliable behavioral data, something like distance from campus or primary market or home county is still probably going to stick in any model of whether a student is likely to apply or whether an admitted student is likely to enroll. And the reason for that is that much of predictive analytics is about proxy measures. So there is a concept in the minds of your prospective students. I mean, you can call it affinity, you can call it desire, you could call it interest. And then there's us trying to measure that concept with imperfect tools like email clicks or virtual event attendance or time on site. And because we cannot open the minds of your prospective students and root around on there to directly measure these concepts, we rely on proxy measures. We rely on things that tend to be correlated with interest and affinity and desire to enroll. And often things like geographic distance, different measures of geography, whether it's distance from campus, whether it's primary market, secondary market, whether it's by county or by state, there's still room in these models for measures like that, because there are still important things about interest or affinity that are left over to be measured, even if we have a really comprehensive and sophisticated suite of behavioral measures. And so that brings us back to EnGauge. I think if you're along for the ride with us today, if you've clicked through on a recorded webinar about engagement scoring, predictive analytics, I'm going to assume that you believe that predictive analytics are at least a little important. I'm also willing to assume that you're intrigued by what you might be able to do with engagement scoring, contributing to better predictive analytics. So in that context, EnGauge is designed to solve 3 distinct problems that we recognize that client institutions face in the variety of different scores that are out there, the different application conversion scoring, the different yield scoring, different retention modeling, and all of these outcomes. The first challenge that we recognize that our clients face is that it's hard to give data to vendors. It just is. Every vendor has their own data request. It has its own format, its own fields, its own methods. Everybody's got their own SFTP solution. Oh, and by the way, the data request also gets added to the workload of someone who already has too much to do, especially if that's a Slate captain or a Slate administrator at your institution. And for every field on that data request, there's at least a little bit of uncertainty about exactly what the vendor wants, and that creates back and forth questions and answers over time. And that means it's hard to give data to vendors. It has also been hard in the past, and this is the second challenge that we want to solve, to extract consistent and comprehensive data from admission CRM solutions with actions that are reliably associated with dates. Slate has helped solve this problem. And for those of us who lived in the wilderness between Recruitment Plus and Slate, we can attest to how much Slate has improved data querying, specific and particularly with interactions and behavioral indicators. So in the past, there might have been CRMs that were collecting this data, but it was a nightmare getting that data out of those CRMs and getting it in a format where we could line it up reliably with the date that it occurred and be sure that all of that data were clean and consistent. The third problem is that in scoring generally in higher ed, and frankly in other industries too, has a what now problem. So any scoring product, whether you're developing it on your own, whether you're receiving it from a vendor, there's a challenge of what are you supposed to do with those scores once you have them? And whether you're supposed to use an external system or whether you're supposed to import them to Slate, there are often problems with viewing, interpreting, and acting on those such that you feel like you have made the best use of that resource. And that means that unfortunately, these scoring products often get relegated to the dusty corner of an SFTP solution, or they're dutifully loaded into Slate, but they're not actually acted on because either the vendor has not provided adequate coaching and training on how to use them, or the institution is not comfortable using them, or there's a gap between what the vendor claims they can do and what the institution believes they can do. So how does EnGauge solve those problems? First, and I think I hinted at this, there's a lot of scoring solutions out there, and there's a lot of skepticism about whether they really work or whether they really claim what they do, and or claim to do whether they do what they claim they do. And I'd love to give you some concrete examples of how EnGauge addresses that skepticism and how that EnGauge is a meaningful and significant improvement in the use of engagement scoring in higher ed. So Megan, if you can go forward 2 slides. First, EnGauge removes the need to give a vendor data, and that's because we're getting the data for you. With EnGauge, the Carnegie Slate team manages the initial data extraction ourselves. Our Slate team sets up the initial queries. They extract the information they need, that we need. We validate that, and then they also set up any recurring data extracts that are needed for ongoing scoring. Separately, they also manage the re-import of scores back into Slate for usage in the EnGauge portal that Megan's going to demo for you in a little bit. There's no interpreting of vendor data requests. There's no back and forth. There's no uncertainty about what every little field means. There's no adding this to the bandwidth or adding this to the workload of someone who already is tight on time. There's frictionless data exchange was one of the driving rationales for EnGauge. Second, the modeling team at Carnegie uses this data, all of the data that the Slate team have extracted from your instance, to build these dynamic machine learning models of student behavior that react over time to the changes in the student behavior that drive probability change in the outcome, whether that's application or enrollment. Third, and frankly, this is the really distinctive part of EnGauge along with that frictionless data exchange, is that the Carnegie team builds custom portals directly in your Slate instance that do three things. They give you an overall snapshot of the scores and year over year and year to date funnel stats. They give you a model performance chart that gives you radical transparency on whether or not the model is working. You'll be able to see directly what the predictions are and what the actuals are. And then third, they provide custom action lists that help your admission and enrollment teams identify students that are most sort of ripe for an intervention. If that's students whose engagement has been most rapidly increasing, students who have taken certain actions that we know are persuasively associated with application or enrollment, or all of the above, which helps you prioritize outreach and especially helps you make the best use of those limited resources, especially when those limited resources are your team's time. The way that we describe it and what you see on this chart in this slide is that EnGauge models are accurate, they're automated, and they're actionable. They're accurate because they are effective at identifying student level probability to take the action, whether it is enrollment or application. They provide action-oriented student lists for outreach and intervention, which is that critical piece of actionable. And everything from the initial data extraction through the modeling and then the regular import of scores back into Slate is automated such that your team does not have to lift a finger to make use of these, that the data extraction, the modeling, and the data re-import are managed by the Carnegie team. One of the really critical pieces of that actionable point, and one of the original rationales for EnGauge that remains one of the strongest rationales, is that these scores and the environment in which you interact with these scores is built directly in Slate. We don't want to push you to a different system with a different login and a different structure. And we know that you spend your days in Slate already, and we know that if the scores are easily accessible, that is as important a part of them being actionable as being able to interpret them. I know you're here for the demo and for what Megan's going to show you in the portal, so I don't want to spend too much time standing between you and Megan. But just one last quick summary on the benefits of EnGauge. First, EnGauge gives you real-time insights to drive decision-making. So imagine being able to tell not only which students were relatively more or less likely to apply, which we think is important in and of itself, or enroll, but also instead imagine that being able to identify which students' probabilities had increased the most in the last 15 days or 30 days, and then being able to feed that information to a counselor in an action list. Further, imagine being the prospective student and researching an institution, spending time on their website, learning more about their academic offerings, about residential life, about financial aid options, and then getting an outreach or an intervention, a text, a call, a message, other personal outreach from a counselor at that institution. That is the sort of well-timed intervention that builds affinity and meaningfully improves conversion at these key points at application or at enrollment. And last, I'll say that as much as we have built EnGauge to provide these just-in-time insights to focus interventions and better understand student behavior, there's another really important use for engagement scoring in these behavioral models generally, and that's how to evaluate your lead sources. As search generally and lead sources specifically have fragmented over the course of the past 4 or 5 years, the task of assessing their relative performance has also become more difficult. You might be accustomed to evaluating lead sources based on their end of cycle conversion rate. And that's a reasonable way to evaluate lead sources, but it might not be fair because there might be some lead sources that you are acquiring or using specifically to tap into populations of students that have lower existing familiarity with your institution and with what you're offering. And that means that it might not be fair just to compare conversion rate to conversion rate or yield rate to yield rate across these origin sources. A more effective way to evaluate these sources, a more effective way to evaluate the mix of how you are acquiring prospective students and prospective student records is to compare the actual conversion to the projected conversion, whether that's application conversion or whether that's yield. And that's how you can identify a truly outperforming or underperforming source. In other words, you might have a lead source where everything about those students, their geography and their lookalikes for what your current pool looked like, suggests that they should be pretty strong on conversion or pretty strong on yield. But then you find once you have access to this behavioral scoring that there's just something not working here, that these are students that are not taking action. They're not engaging with your web properties. They're not clicking on your action items in your emails. They're not interacting with you in a meaningful way. And because that behavior is not occurring, regardless of their geography, their EnGauge scores are going to be lower. And so the key there is evaluating projected versus actual. And that's the way to tell that despite everything else about these students looking like they were a promising opportunity, it's just not happening for whatever of a variety of reasons. And we think that that is a far more effective way to focus resources and to consider, should we divest from this source and invest in sources where they're outperforming, where the students are engaging with us at higher rates. And that's a more effective way to manage those limited resources, especially in a very fragmented search environment. So thank you for coming along on the ride with me on the EnGauge backstory. I'm going to hand you off now to Megan, who's going to talk through one of our EnGauge client case studies and their success story, and then also give you a demo of the EnGauge environment in Slate. Megan, all yours.
Thank you, Mike. I learn something new every single time you do that backstory. Not that we talk about it all that often, but I feel like we actually do. Happy to talk you through Georgia Southern's enrollment success. They were one of our first EnGauge beta partners, and they were definitely both a search and an EnGauge partner. And I want to pair those two together because, we're not here necessarily to say that EnGauge alone, is going to be the game changer to your enrollment efforts, but those paired with all of our search strategies, we think can be. So Georgia Southern, they were really focused on first-year recruitment strategy, and we're able to use both our search efforts and our EnGauge efforts for likelihood to apply and enroll to exceed their enrollment expectations in 2024. So you can see those scores or those stats down there at the bottom, a 30% increase in applications, an 11% increase in deposits, and my favorite, and maybe our partner's favorite, is that 9.7% increase in enrollment. So we know, based on everything that Mike said, if you can spend your time and your money in the places where you should be, you're going to see those results. And what that looked like, if you take some of the benefits that Mike shared into some of these actual action items in those sub bullets there on the slide, they prioritize application deadline calls, right? When you have an application deadline coming up and you have a whole list of students who you're hoping are going to meet that deadline, it can be hard to know who to call and where do you spend your time on that long list. And so to be able to actually call less students and get more applications using these scores, that's a huge win for an enrollment office. They refined their financial aid contact list. Same story, right? If you have a list of students who you think all need financial aid, but then you can actually take your EnGauge scores and narrow that list down to the appropriate set of students that are it's going to make the most impact on, that is another huge win. And last but not least, I think anytime I think of EnGauge and where I'd love to see it make an impact is in mailing. We know how much it costs to print and postage and all of that. So if you can curate a list using not only the variables that are the students that should get that, but really with that EnGauge score, you can actually, again, mail less and see more of an impact. All of this saving, again, time and money. I wanted to pull a quote here because I don't want you to just take Mike and I's word for it. Caleb Rogers, who is our contact at Georgia Southern and is the former associate director of admissions and recruitment, he specifically said the EnGauge score process helped our recruitment initiatives greatly by allowing us to refine our efforts and spend our time and money working with the right students, ultimately allowing us to put our resources where they mattered the most and saving us time and money while exceeding all of our undergraduate enrollment goals. And I can promise you I did not pay him to say that. That was his exact quote. And it speaks to what we think this can do. It's a very powerful tool, and I don't want to hold off on showing it to you any longer. So I'm going to jump into the demo. I'm going to walk through how we gather and leverage that data. As Mike said, getting that data in a consistent format and in a way that we know we're pulling what we hope we're pulling in Slate is really important. So build a series of queries to gather the historical data. get that over to the modeling team so that they can associate the right weights with each of those variables, thus producing that likelihood to apply score and that likelihood to enroll score. Getting that back into Slate, into the dashboard, which I'll show you a total funnel view, some year-over-year data, and some counselor lists where, great, we have these scores, we can see them in aggregate, but then can I also get them on the individual student level? And you absolutely can. And that is where that actionable piece comes into play. So I'm going to stop sharing so I can switch over to Slate. And I want to say thank you, obviously, to our beta partners who have approved that we share all of these screens. Okay, so this is the default landing page within the EnGauge dashboard. And you can see here, we have a couple tabs at the top. Those are the ones I'll be running you through: total funnel, the EnGauge apply screen, and the EnGauge enroll screen. On the total funnel screen, we can see that I have all of my funnel data points for the last 3 years. And as I click on each of those, they change year over year in this full funnel here. But then also over here, we have each of those different student status points or statuses, prospects through net deposits. Each of these has where I am currently, how that fares year to date, and over the last 2 cycles as well. All of this is customizable, right? I would never sit up here and tell you that we're going to be building all of this in your Slate instance and can't rename these to the statuses that you call them, or maybe you track deposits and net deposits differently, as everyone does, and use different filters to put people in different buckets. We will work with you to make sure that all of this shows the way that you want it to, and will match all of the stats you have throughout your instance elsewhere. As you scroll down, you'll see that there are a series of reports that support each of these 6 buckets here. So I'm currently sitting on applicants, and I have 3 reports under that tab, though these reports match each of these different statuses. On this first one, I have applicants point in time. So I can see here on February 11th, where was I for 23, 24, 25, and what that looks like over time. Underneath that, I have a monthly breakout, again, across those 3 cycles. And right here, when I break out August versus September, these are broken out by counselor name, which we've hidden, obviously, for security purposes, but you can have counselor name there. You can have really whatever metric you want in Slate to slice and dice these applicant numbers by. And then on the right here, we have in-state and out-of-state. Again, these were chosen by our beta partner as the metrics they wanted to see, again, year over year. I can break out in-state by county, by high school. That was their preference. Again, we can slice this however you'd like. And all 3 of these reports are under each one of these different tabs here. Mike, I'm curious, is there anything you'd want to add as you look at this total funnel, or why you like this view?
Yeah, I think that with this reporting, this is always the right lens to start with. And these reports have been built such that you're going from sort of assessment to action, right? So the assessment is in the aggregate, how are things going? And then the natural progression for admission and enrollment leaders is say, okay, how can I take advantage of opportunities, or how can I identify areas where we need to do more? And so I've always really liked the flow here to start with this funnel. And we're not going to pretend like you don't have other funnel reports on your Slate instance, but having EnGauge start with the funnel report is a reminder that this all proceeds naturally from assessment through to action.
Yeah, thank you for that. It is a good point. We know you have funnel reports elsewhere, or we know that it's likely that you do. But even if you do, we want you to be able to have a one-stop shop to see all of this data. So having this be the front part of the EnGauge dashboard was a very intentional move. But again, if you don't need it there, we can always remove it. So I'm going to jump into the EnGauge apply screen. So when you click on that EnGauge apply tab at the top, it breaks you down into the action lists, but there's also the model performance report, and then there's reporting. So when I'm on the action list, you'll see that I have 3 what I call kind of presets, where maybe I want to see those with biggest score increases, or those with high interest no visit, or those with a high interest recent inquiry. Those are all customizable as well. And we can put, if there's certain campaigns that you do, whether it's a calling campaign to push for FAFSA filers, or maybe you want to connect with parents throughout at one point in the year, whatever that could be, you could have more of those green buttons at the top, so that maybe you tell your counselors, okay, today we're going to go in and we're going to take this certain campaign to call all of the 8s and up within this indicator or not, however that looks for you. When you're on this screen, you can sort by any of these columns, again, all of which are customizable. And let's say you want to pop up the student, again, names are here, hidden for security purposes, but you can go straight to their Slate record. You can send them an email right from here. And of course, if I click this email button, it would pop up the institution's email view and have all those snippets there on the side. So you could easily make those email campaigns, those one-on-one email campaigns, a lot more efficient. That call text piece, if you have their phone number, that would appear there. And again, you can call straight from the Slate instance or send a text message through and log that on their timeline. And then, of course, log another interaction, select that interaction type and log it directly to their Slate record. When I'm on the student screen, before I take action, I have a number of fields here that are in addition to the fields that are behind that screen. Again, all customizable. I have score history, which is, I think, one of my favorite parts, so that when you're connecting with that student or reaching out, you can see, am I at a point where maybe they're getting more engaged over time, or maybe they were engaged for a little bit and then they kind of backed off and now they're getting hot again. What is that story and how does that change the conversation that you're about to have with that student? And then interactions history, of course, just so you can see what are some of the other events on their record, or maybe things that they've attended, or where we got their name, whatever that looks like. The thing about this is it can basically work like any of your other fetch lists. So if you want to see more or less on the screen, if you, of course, I'm currently, pretending to be a certain counselor, so I'm only seeing that territory. But if you're an admin that needs to see all territories, we can play with those permissionings as well. If I move over to the model performance report, again, this action list, model performance, and reporting are in each of the different tabs. This model performance report gives you some of that transparency that Mike was referring to on just how well the model is doing or isn't doing. And you can see by each of these different statuses what the projected number of that status is and that projected conversion rate and how that's applying and acting in real time. You can see that it's taking a second to load, which is classic Slate. I do have the reporting tab pulled up with an EnGauge, so maybe I'll pop over there and we can come back to the model performance. This is the reporting tab with EnGauge Enroll, but this tab, and model performance is here too. So this tab actually gives us both, again, customizable between which tab you want it on and where do you want it to show. But you can see here we have both that model performance report and this map, which allows you to say, okay, I want to see sort of like a Voyager report, a heat map. I want to see the females and then kind of scroll in and see the map, get more granular as I scroll here. Zooming in on Southern Indiana, where I'm from, and see who are those different students and what are their actions and what are their EnGauge scores and can I take this list and help me narrow in maybe if I'm planning travel or if I'm planning that call list. So an example of a report that we've been asked to give, but I think we're still trying to figure out what reports do you want to see here. We can, add in a data explorer if you want your own interactive drag and drop report. So lots of options within reporting. Since this modeling report load, actually, I'm curious, Mike, you can see, like I was saying, like the different projections and real-time conversion rates and things like that. What's your takeaway when you look at these?
So I think there's two things. Well, there's three things, right? One is that we provide the model performance report, and if the EnGauge Apply model performance report has loaded, that's our standard one, and I can talk over it while it loads.
Oh, there we go.
Perfect. So the first thing to note here is that the 1s through 10s are basically approximate deciles of the entire population. So in this case, all prospects at the institution. You can see that we highlight inquiries, and as you would not be surprised to find, inquiries tend to be clustered far more frequently, and there's a far higher proportion of higher engaged categories from 1 to 10, from least likely to take the action, which in this case is application, to most likely. The other thing I want to note is that there's two ways to interpret this. One is that it is critical that we design models that ensure that the directionality is correct. In other words, that actual application conversion follows that sort of linear trend as you go up the scores. And because the projections, the sort of initial pieces, can we tell you who is more or less likely to apply? Then within each bucket, there's also a comparison of the actual conversion to the projected conversion. And this is going to be a little noisy no matter what. Even the best models, these frankly are still mostly 17 to 20-year-olds at the traditional undergraduate level. There's variation in their behavior, there's variation in the outcomes, The institution might be acquiring new lead sources that have different behavior than we've trained the models on. So there's always going to be a push and pull, but there must be a sort of initial assessment, and this must pass the smell test that actual conversion is sufficiently close to projected conversion that it builds that trust in you and in your team to be able to act on these confidently. And so that's why we provide the model performance report. You won't ever need to ask us, is it working? There will be some seasonality to this, which is that like early in the application cycle, you're going to see most of the conversions happening in the 7s through 10s, because that's where the true believers are, and that's who's applying early. As you get toward the application deadline, you're going to start to see more of those students fill in. If you don't have an application deadline, if you're an open access institution, if you're an institution that receives applications widely into the summer prior to enrollment, then you'll see that sort of shape up, and there will be this sort of natural rhythm and cadence to this work that you're accustomed to from existing enrollment work. But first and foremost, it's important for us to make this available to you so that you can assess it, or so that the enrollment strategist can assess this with you and identify how this shifts over time during the cycle.
Thanks, Mike. That's a really good point about, you mentioned the enrollment strategist. That goes back to that actionable piece, right? There's, in no world do I want to leave you with that what now that Mike was referring to, where you look at this action list. I'm going to jump back over, that you look at this action list and you think, wow, okay, again, I have all these scores. I can see their engagement. Now what? We want to help you figure out, based on the results of your scores, what are those different presets? What variables are the leading variables for you in likelihood to apply or enroll? And how do we get more students to take that action? And how do we find out the students who haven't taken that action and get them to? So lots here in terms of the data that you can see, the action that you can take. I can't say that it's customizable enough, because literally all of these decisions are decisions that you can make, or you can rely on us to help show you this is what you should be seeing on these screens. And that all goes back to that transparency of having all of it live in your instance. It's data that you own, and so you should have direct access to what are the scores, what are, what makes up the model. I've, switched screens a couple of times. These are all the lists of the queries that we make to get that data built for historical classes and for your current class. So, yeah, there's just something to, I think I'm speaking, to everyone who knows this, but there's something to having everything in your Slate instance and to be able to take action and never have to leave that system, and track all the efforts that you're taking, and hopefully furthering the higher engagement over time as you take those actions. I'm going to stop sharing and jump back into our deck as we go to close us out here. We wanted to wrap with some frequently asked questions. What are some of the questions that Mike and I have been getting as we start to do this introduction of EnGauge Scores across the Slate and other communities? Again, we had some open question and answer, and maybe Mike, I think there was one that was submitted that you'd love to share with the group, and then a recap of some of our key takeaways. So frequently asked questions. Can we include custom variables in your Slate instance? 100%. We will include all of the variables that we know we should be looking at, and then look to you to say, what are some of those institution-specific actions that you're taking that you're like, I really hope that this, maybe it's a specific calling campaign or a specific event or a certain form that you ask students to fill out, that hopefully is making an impact on a student's likelihood to apply or enroll. And so we wouldn't want to discount that effort, and help you figure out, is it making the impact that you think it's making? Are these models custom to each institution? 100%. We think there's value in tailoring the model to your efforts. And we, while we want to draw conclusions from trends across our partner institutions, we never would want to assume that a student's response to a certain effort for one institution matches that to an effort that you're making. So these are all custom. Do we incorporate other scores? Yes. So if you're already getting scores from another vendor or something that you're creating in-house, and you want that to work into your EnGauge score, we can do that as well. And will you know what to do with your scores? Yes. We'll make sure that you're partnered not only for a training on maintenance for that EnGauge dashboard, but also on a utilization training for how you and your counselors should be using that score. And then what are some of those strategies that maybe are a little bit even larger of what to do with those scores once you have them? Mike, do you want to share any questions that you got during the webinar?
Sure, but we had two that I think I want to address because they were among the questions that weren't already addressed in the course of the presentation. The first is, what if I have data in my student information system that I want to incorporate into this? And this gets back to that automated piece. And we have intentionally limited what is available to the model for modeling, but also then for obviously for tagging and reporting to data that reside in Slate. And that's a critical piece because that means that we can promise that frictionless exchange. We do all sorts of other modeling work on our team at Carnegie where we collect information from the student information system separately and integrate that into yield modeling or integrate that into retention modeling. It's difficult to automate that because it is more difficult to automate the export of data reliably and consistently from student information systems than it is from Slate. And so the answer is, if the information resides in your SIS at present, it can't be incorporated automatically into EnGauge. But there are two pieces. One is that we would love to talk to you, and the Carnegie Slate team would love to help you get that sort of bidirectional data flow so that you are getting some of those critical SIS pieces into Slate so that you have access to aid packages, aid package data in Slate, so you have access to FAFSA filing data in Slate, because we know that Slate is where you are living and breathing and it's where you want your students to be in these portals. I've seen portals for the different student information systems. I won't name them, but I've seen these portals and they aren't as functional, they aren't as attractive, they aren't as user friendly as portals that are built in Slate. So we would love to be able to talk to you about getting some of that data into Slate so that we can make effective use of it in these models, but also so that you can make effective use of it in all sorts of other things, in comms campaigns and in task lists and checklists. And there's all sorts of great reasons to make Slate and to make the student interface for Slate your one-stop shop, especially for prospective and enrolling students. The second piece is that in the longer term, and especially if you are an institution that can promise a timely and consistent automated data flow from an SIS, there is nothing structural preventing us from collecting a file from Slate and a file from your SIS and then bringing those together on our side. The challenge and why we haven't integrated this as a promise as part of EnGauge is because our experience is that automated export capability with student information systems is just not where Slate is, not to the level of Slate's right now. And so that means that we don't want to promise that as baseline functionality. But if this is something where you say there is not going to be a bidirectional data flow between Slate and the SIS, but we think it's critical to incorporate that data, we're happy to have that conversation about, okay, can we get an automated extract? And then we can take it from there. The second question that came up was, what sort of outside data do you use? And so Megan mentioned that these are custom to each institution, which means we're not pooling data across institutions. We are training the model on your data, your institution, and then while we're not pooling data across institutions, we are pulling in other data about things like income and educational attainment and home ownership and the sorts of consumer behavioral data that tend to be good at supplementing or sharpening predictions about big purchase decisions like a higher education enrollment decision. Currently, for that same reason I just mentioned, we want to get that data directly from Slate. And that means that right now what we rely on is the sources like the American Community Survey data in Slate, which I think just refreshed so that it's nice and up to date. And that's where we're getting some of that geodemographic data currently. So again, all of this native to Slate, both the from and the to piece. That also means that if there are other things that you think are meaningful in how you measure or how you want to consider application conversion and yield, things like landscape scores or other things that bring in elements of geodemographic scores, as long as those are in Slate, they can be incorporated into the extract, incorporated into the modeling, incorporated into the tagging, and then associated with the scores that are put back into Slate. And so those are the two questions that I think came up yesterday that weren't addressed in the presentation, and I thought were the most sort of value add for us to discuss specifically. But of course, and as Megan will reemphasize, we're always open to having a conversation and addressing any specific questions our client institutions have.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And so to recap our takeaways, if you remember nothing else, remember that EnGauge scores are accurate. They will do what they say they're going to do and tell you a student's likelihood to apply and a likelihood to enroll. These are automated. Will be day-to-day updates on your scores and in the dashboard. They're actionable. You'll know what to do with them when you get them at both the aggregate and the individual level. And all that leads to the fact that they work and that the engagement scores of the past, I think, have just missed the mark, and that I'm excited to have partnered with Mike and team to bring to you all an engagement score that does work and that does do what it says it's going to do. One of the things we've alluded to a couple times is the fact that we work with a number of beta partners. And I think what I'm most looking forward to is in a year or two to be able to look at our beta partners and say, okay, 2 years ago, we yielded the 7s at this % rate, and it cost us this much. And this year we were able to save a little bit and enroll the 8s at a normal yield rate and spend a little bit more on the 7s to get that yield rate up higher, and to be able to over time track where the time and money savings are actually paying off in terms of actual enrollment and actual net tuition revenue. So lots to look forward to. We've also been calling them beta partners. So I will just clarify that EnGauge Scores are now available, and we have completely closed our beta process. So if you're interested in being a full partner with us in this, feel free to reach out. And we have some resources here. The blog that we released telling you basically all of this and more. The learn more piece here is on get engagement scores that actually work. That will take you to the landing page where we have a recorded demo of just a walkthrough of the demo or the dashboard that I showed. And then again, this is all part of our larger student search effort. So we have a very yield focused approach to search, and how to do that without knowing a student's likelihood to apply and likely to enroll. I wouldn't dream of it. So excited to pair this into our overarching search effort. Thank you for your time today. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions to Mike or myself, and we hope to partner with you in the future.